So you know that there is this thing called global scope and local scope. Now, why does this even matter? Thus far, everything worked. Well, here's something which will not work. I'm printing my age here. What if instead I would try to print my name? You could argue that this should work. My name is defined here after all. So I'm console logging it here a bit further down in my code file. If we save this and we go back to the browser, you will see, however, that we get a reference error here. My name is not defined. Now that's strange. Somehow JavaScript seems to have problems finding my name, even though we clearly declare and define it here. Well, maybe it's just because we haven't executed the function yet. So let's move it down a bit. Let's make sure we first execute greet, which is where we really then declare and define my name. So by the point of time line 9 runs, this line definitely was executed. Let's save again and let's give this another try. And you see hello Max of course prints, but I get the same error as before when I try to log my name here in line 9. And this is scope in action. There is a very simple rule when it comes to scope. And that rule is that variables in an outer scope are accessible from inner scopes, but not the other way around. Which means if we have a variable or a function defined in local scope, so in function scope, then we only have access to that variable or function inside of that function where it was defined of, or in any other nested functions, because outer scope is accessible in inner scope. If something is defined in global scope, it's therefore available everywhere because global scope is the outmost scope we can use. There is no scope above it. So any function defined anywhere can use features from global scope because from outer to inner works, from inner to outer does not work. Let's see that in action. Here we have a function. Now, to prove my point, using my age, which is in the global scope, should work here. So if I extend this greeting a bit and I add another line here, let's actually maybe shrink this here so that we have more space to read this. So if I add another line here and I say I am, and then I want to have my age, and then say years old, I simply have to insert my age here, like this. And this will work because this is the global scope. We're using it in a function. So inside of the function, we have function scope. But of course, the global scope is a more outer scope. It's around that function. So inside of the function, we can use my age from the global scope. So if we save this, we'll still get this error. But above that, we see that output with I am 31 years old. And 31 is of course coming from the myAge variable, which is defined in global scope. And as you also see down there, where I try to access my name, going the other direction fails. If something is defined in function scope, you can't use it in global scope. Now there also are nested scopes. You don't just have one global scope and one function scope, but you can have multiple local scopes. Of course, for one, you can add more than one function, but you can also add a function inside of a function. That is actually something not everyone knows, but it is absolutely possible. Let me show you how it works. We could have a function print age in here. And that function actually prints the age statement. For whatever reason, we have an extra function for that. Of course, this is a very simplified and kind of made-up example here, but it's about scope mainly here, not about building the most realistic application. So here we have a function inside of a function, and as I said, declaring and defining functions inside of other functions is a perfectly fine thing to do. It's a default JavaScript feature. We can now call printAge here. We can call it here because we're in the greet function, which is where we define printAge. So we're using printAge in the same scope as we define it. Using printAge down there would, by the way, not work, for the same reason why we can't access my name. It is defined inside of the greet function, so inside of the scope of the greet function. Using it in an outer scope is not possible because we can only go from outer to inner. What does work, however, is that we access my age in here, because we're in a function scope, inside of another function scope, inside of the global scope. And as you learned, going down in scopes works. So using my age here, when it's defined in the global scope, works. Hence, if we save this, and we go back and reload, I get the same output as before, now with the nested function. And we cannot just use features from the global scope in nested functions. If we rename this to print info, and we move the my name statement in there as well, and then call print info here, this will also work. If I now save this and reload, we also get the same output as before. And now I'm using my age from the global scope, but also my name from the local scope, but not this local scope, but the greet local scope. But this works because the greet local scope wraps the print info local scope, and from outer to inner works. By the way, if you're confused why we can use my name here when we only define it here, keep in mind that we call print info below my name, so therefore it's actually available here. Still, this is a concept I will come back to, why this works and some of the tricky quirks about that. To be super safe, we can just move this up, and now it all makes perfect sense. So this is global and local scope, and scope in general, and this important rule of scopes that from outer to inner works, but the other direction does not work.